Jake walked alone through the thick forest as the sun slowly disappeared behind the hills. The trees around him were tall, silent, and cold. The air was heavy and full of the scent of damp earth and old leaves. He liked walking here where no one came anymore. The forest had been closed for years after strange lights were seen in the sky above it, and after a few people vanished without a trace. But Jake never believed in rumors. He was not scared of dark places or old stories. Today he followed a trail of broken branches that led deeper into the forest. His boots pressed into the soft ground, and every step made a quiet crunch. Suddenly he heard something strange, not the sound of a bird or animal. It was soft like crying, but high and sharp. It came again, this time louder, a sound full of fear and pain. He stopped and listened. His heart beat faster. He looked around but saw nothing, so he followed the sound, careful and slow. It came from near the old, collapsed cave at the bottom of the valley. No one had gone near it since it caved in last year. It was dangerous, full of sharp rocks and loose earth, but Jake climbed down anyway. The crying grew clearer as he got closer. He pushed through a wall of hanging vines and entered the cave. The entrance was half blocked with stones, but there was a small hole just big enough to crawl through. He took out his flashlight and squeezed. Inside, the cave was dark and cold and smelled like wet metal. The beam of light shook in his hand as he moved forward, and then he saw it in the center of the small space. Something glowed faint blue and pulsed like a heartbeat. It was a cage made of strange glass-like material, and inside, curled up and shaking, was a tiny girl, not human. Her skin was pale purple with glowing freckles. Her eyes were huge and full of tears. Her body was thin and wrapped in silver cloth. She looked up at him and whimpered. Jake dropped to his knees and stared. He had never seen anything like her. He did not know if she was real or if he was dreaming, but the fear in her eyes was real. She was trapped. Her wrists were chained to the cage floor, and her ankles, too. She could barely move. She looked weak and tired, like she had been there for days, maybe longer. He reached out and touched the cage. It was cold, but did not shock him. He tried to pull the door open, but it would not move. He looked around and found a small panel with strange symbols. He pressed one, and the lock clicked. The door opened slowly with a soft hiss. The girl flinched and covered her face, but Jake did nothing. He spoke gently, telling her it was okay, even if she could not understand him. He stepped back and waited. She opened one eye, then slowly crawled out of the cage. Her legs shook as she almost fell. Jake caught her before she hit the ground. She was light like a feather, and her skin was cold. He wrapped his jacket around her. She looked up into his face, and for a second he saw something deep in her eyes, a mix of relief, confusion, and a tiny spark of trust. Suddenly the cave shook. A loud growl echoed through the stone, a deep sound that made Jake freeze. Something outside had felt the cage open. Something was coming, and it was not friendly. He grabbed the girl and pulled her up. She clung to him, weak but willing. He crawled back through the tunnel and out into the dying light of the forest. The growl came again, this time closer. He ran up the slope, carrying her in his arms. The trees moved above like black giants. The wind picked up and leaves flew around them like a storm. The girl buried her face in his chest. Jake reached the top and looked back. A shadow moved near the cave entrance, tall and wide with glowing red eyes. It stepped into the open just as Jake disappeared behind the ridge. He did not stop running until he reached his truck parked near the edge of the forest. He placed the girl on the seat and slammed the door behind them. His hands shook as he started the engine behind them. In the trees, something screamed, a horrible high sound like metal tearing apart and fire burning at the same time. The girl covered her ears and cried. Again Jake looked at her and knew he had just stepped into something far bigger than he ever imagined. He reached over and took her hand. She looked at him through watery eyes, and for the first time gave a small nod like she was saying thank you. He drove away as fast as he could with the tiny alien girl beside him, unaware that this was just the beginning. The road ahead was silent, with only the sound of tires rolling over cracked stones. The trees on both sides stood tall like guards watching the truck pass through. The night sky above was clouded and dark, the stars hidden as if they too were afraid of what followed behind. Jake kept glancing at the rearview mirror, his hands tight on the wheel, his heart heavy with fear. The alien girl beside him lay wrapped in his jacket, her head resting on the door, her breathing soft but shaky. She had not spoken since they escaped the cave, but her eyes kept moving, watching the forest as if expecting something to appear any second. Jake tried to speak once, asking if she was okay, but she only gave a small nod and turned her gaze back to the trees. Her tiny fingers gripped the edge of the seat like she was holding on to life itself. Jake reached the town edge where his grandfather's old cabin stood hidden behind broken fences and tall grass. He had not visited this place in years, but it felt safer than his house. He turned off the headlights and drove quietly into the yard. The truck engine sighed as it stopped, and Jake climbed out. He gently lifted the girl into his arms and carried her inside. The wooden door creaked as it opened. The smell of dust and old memories filled the air inside the cabin. The girl looked around with wide, curious eyes. Jake placed her on the couch and lit a lantern, casting a soft golden light across the room. He grabbed blankets from the shelf and wrapped her again. She looked tired but more at ease than before. Still, she flinched at every sound outside. The wind howled and trees scratched the windows like claws dragging across glass. Jake moved to the kitchen, poured some water, and brought it to her. She hesitated, but took it with both hands, drinking slowly. He noticed marks on her wrists, red and bruised from the chains. He felt anger boil inside him. Whoever did this to her would not go unpunished. He sat down beside her and tried again to speak gently, slowly, carefully asking who she was, where she came from, what was chasing her. She looked at him with those deep, glowing eyes full of galaxies and sadness. Then she reached forward and touched his temple, her fingers cold but gentle, and suddenly Jake felt something strange. Not pain, not noise, but images, voices, memories flooding into his head like a silent movie played in seconds. He saw a planet with twin suns, a city floating in the sky, children laughing under silver trees, and then fire explosions. Black ships in the air, soldiers with glowing weapons and cages. He saw the girl taken from her mother, locked inside a glass prison. Her screams unheard as her home disappeared in flames. The connection broke and Jake gasped, his head spinning. The girl pulled back her hand, shaking, her eyes filled with tears. She looked away, ashamed or maybe scared of what he now knew. Jake leaned forward and whispered softly that she was safe now, that he would protect her no matter what. The cabin shook as a low sound rolled through the earth like thunder from below. Jake jumped to his feet. The girl froze, eyes wide. The sound came again. Closer this time, a long growl mixed with clicking like metal claws tapping on stone. Jake grabbed his flashlight and looked out the window. Nothing but dark trees swaying in the wind, but something was out there watching. Moved to the back door and locked it, then checked the front again. The girl stood now beside the couch, pointing to the floor, then to the window. Her hand moved quickly, tracing shapes in the air like writing symbols. Jake realized she was warning him. More than one was coming. They were not alone. The growl returned, now joined by a second, deeper, louder. The trees outside cracked and shifted. Something heavy stepped between them. Jake grabbed an old hunting rifle from the wall. It had not been used in years, but it was better than nothing. The girl suddenly ran to him and grabbed his arm, shaking her head. She pointed to the floor again. Then the trapdoor near the fireplace. Jake understood. He lifted the old rug and opened the trapdoor, revealing a narrow space below the cabin. A storage room. He helped her down first, then climbed in and closed the hatch above them. The space was cold and dark, but hidden. The girl sat close to him, trembling, her head resting against his arm. Footsteps thudded above. Slow, heavy, each step made dust fall from the wooden beams. Something walked across the room, sniffing, growling, whispering in a language Jake could not understand. The footsteps circled the room, then stopped near the trapdoor. A pause, silence, and then the sound of claws scraping against wood, slow and sharp. Jake held his breath. The girl covered her mouth. Both sat frozen in the dark. The creature above seemed unsure, then moved away, its footsteps fading slowly into the night. After a long while, Jake opened the hatch and peeked out. The room was empty, the door wide open, the wind cold. The danger not gone, but for now they were safe. He closed the door behind him and looked at the girl. Her eyes met his again, this time with a tiny flicker of hope, and in that moment he knew running was no longer enough. They had to fight back. The night passed slowly as Jake stayed awake near the couch where the tiny alien girl slept, her face calm, but her body curled tightly like she was afraid the world might break her again. Outside, the wind had stopped. The trees stood silent, and the stars began to appear one by one as the clouds moved away. Jake watched her for a long time, trying to understand everything he had seen in the vision she shared. He could not forget the fire, the screams, the way she was torn from her mother. He had never felt so much pain from someone else. When the first light of morning touched the windows, she stirred her eyes open slowly, blinking at the new day. She sat up holding the blanket close and looked around, confused but more awake than before. Jake greeted her with a soft voice, offering warm food. He had cooked simple eggs and toast, nothing special, but the smell filled the room and made her curious. She took the plate in her hands and looked at it for a moment before eating carefully. Slowly, like she had forgotten what it felt like to eat without fear. Jake sat across from her, wondering how to reach her again. He pointed to himself and said his name clearly. Jake then pointed at her, waiting. She stayed quiet at first, then touched her chest and spoke one word, soft and light like wind in the trees. Lyra. He smiled and repeated her name. She looked surprised, then gave a small nod, a tiny smile, barely visible but real. Lyra looked down at the floor, then reached for Jake's hand. Her fingers touched his skin and the vision came again, but this time it was different, slower, clearer. She showed him her world before the war, a beautiful place filled with colors. He had never seen plants that sang in the wind, creatures with wings made of light, and skies that shifted with emotion. Her people lived in harmony, guided by empathy and shared thought. They did not use words like humans, but shared feelings directly through touch. Then came the ships, dark and silent from the void. Strangers with cold eyes and machines that cut through the sky. They came not to learn or share, but to take. They broke the peace and captured anyone with strong energy. Lyra had it. They called it core light, and they locked her in the cage to drain it slowly as a source of power. She showed Jake her fear, her loneliness, her hope that someone would find her. She showed him how she waited in the dark, not knowing if anyone even cared. The vision faded as her hands slipped away. Jake's eyes were wet. Though he had not noticed, her story was inside him now like a second heartbeat. He whispered that she would never be alone again. She looked at him and said her first human word, "Thank you." Her voice was quiet and shaky, but filled with truth. Jake could not speak. He just nodded. Suddenly, a noise came from outside the cabin, not a growl this time, but wheels on gravel. Someone had arrived. Jake stood quickly and peeked through the curtains. A black van was parked in the yard with no license plate. Two figures stepped out, both wearing suits and dark glasses. They looked normal at first, but moved too smooth, too perfect, like machines pretending to be human. Jake told Lyra to hide, and she slid behind the old bookshelf, quiet as a shadow. A knock came loud and sharp. Jake opened the door, only halfway. The taller agent spoke with a flat voice, saying they were with special investigation, and asked if he had seen anything unusual in the forest. Jake lied calmly, saying he had just been hunting alone. The agent stared at him without blinking. The other walked slowly around the porch, sniffing the air like a bloodhound. Jake felt a chill run down his spine. He asked if they had a warrant. They did not answer. Instead, the taller one leaned closer and said in a cold tone, "You touched the signal." Jake kept his face blank, but his heart raced. The man reached into his coat and pulled out a small black device with glowing lines. It buzzed faintly as it scanned Jake, then flashed red before they could react. Lyra jumped from behind the shelf, her small hand glowing with blue light. She touched the wall, and a pulse of energy burst through the room, knocking both agents off their feet. They scrambled back to the van and drove away fast into the trees, leaving behind a strange burning smell in the air. Jake turned to Lyra. Shocked, she looked dizzy but unharmed. He asked what she did, and she replied one word: defense. Jake realized these agents were not human. They were trackers, synthetic beings designed to hunt and report, and now they knew where Lyra was. He looked at her and said, "We cannot stay here." She nodded. They packed quickly. Jake took maps, supplies, old camping gear, anything they could carry. He helped Lyra into the truck and started the engine. As they drove into the rising sun, the road ahead unknown, but the choice was clear. They had to run, and they had to survive together. Jox pulled the rifle and aimed, but Ziri stepped in front of him and held her arms out wide and shouted a word that made the air tremble, and the bracelet on her wrist flashed with light, and the creature paused and tilted its head as if confused, and then growled and raised its weapon. But Jox fired first, and the shot echoed through the trees, and birds fled into the sky, and the night came alive. The gunshot echoed through the forest like a thunderclap, and the air shook as birds flew from trees, and branches snapped under the weight of wings, and leaves fell like soft rain. And Jox kept his grip tight on the rifle as the creature staggered back from the impact and made a sound that was not pain but surprise. And Ziri stood still in front of him, her hands raised, her eyes glowing, and her body shining faintly like a light behind fog, and the bracelet pulsed again with a soft blue glow that matched the beat of her heart. The creature roared and stepped forward again, and Jocks fired a second shot, but this time the bullet hit the armor and bounced off like a pebble on stone, and the creature laughed. Or maybe it was something worse, something twisted that tried to sound like joy and failed, and it charged at them with the long spear raised high, and Jocks moved to shield Ziri, but she pushed him aside and held the bracelet up like a shield, and it released a wave of light that stopped the creature mid-step. It stood frozen for a second as if caught in ice, and its red eyes flickered like dying fire, and Ziri shouted a word in her language, and the bracelet grew brighter and sent another pulse through the air, and the creature dropped the spear and fell to its knees and let out a scream that sounded like metal being torn, and it slammed its fists into the ground and vanished into thin air like smoke being pulled by the wind. Jocks stared in shock, and Ziri collapsed into his arms, and he caught her gently and felt how light she was, how cold her skin had become. And he carried her away from the ridge, through the trees, and down the path they had climbed in the forest. It was alive now with whispers and rustling and the sound of footsteps that did not belong to them, and Jocks moved fast and careful, holding her close and checking every shadow and every sound, and he knew they were not safe yet. When they reached the cabin, he locked the door and placed Ziri on the bed and covered her with every blanket he had, and lit the fire again and sat beside her, waiting and watching as her chest rose slowly and her fingers twitched like she was dreaming, and her face was pale but calm, and the bracelet lay beside her, now dark and quiet, and Jocks picked it up and held it in his hands, trying to understand what it had done and what it had cost. Hours passed like clouds, and the fire crackled, and outside the wind grew louder, and Jocks stayed awake the whole time, listening for more footsteps or more growls or anything that meant the danger had returned. But the night remained quiet, and Ziri slept without waking, and the bracelet remained still, and Jocks felt helpless but not afraid, because something in him had changed, and he knew that he would fight anything to keep her safe. When morning came with gray skies and soft light, Ziri opened her eyes slowly and looked at him and tried to speak, but her voice was weak, and Jocks gave her water and helped her sit up, and she looked at the bracelet, then at him, and then at the window, and she drew a shape in the air with her fingers, a circle with 3 lines inside, and Jocks recognized it from the map she had shown before, and he pointed to the clearing on the paper, and she nodded and placed her hand on her heart. She whispered a word that sounded like home, and her eyes filled with tears, and Jocks felt something break inside him, because he knew she missed her people, her world, her sky, and he wished he could give her all of it, but all he had was a cabin, a rifle, and 2 hands willing to do anything for her. And he took her hand and gave her a soft nod, and she smiled for the first time since the fight, and that smile was the brightest thing he had seen in years. Later they sat together near the fire, and Ziri opened the bracelet and showed him the damage and the missing pieces, and Jocks brought his tools, and they worked side by side, her fingers moving with care, his hands steady with focus, and together they started to fix what was broken. Not just the bracelet, but the fear, the silence, the loneliness that had lived between them, and each wire connected was a promise that they were not alone anymore. As the sky darkened again and the forest returned to its stillness, Jocks looked out the window and saw nothing but trees and shadows, but he felt ready and strong, and Ziri sat beside him with her head resting on his shoulder, and her breath soft and steady, and the bracelet pulsed gently with new light. Not blue, not red, but a mix of both, like peace and warning together. And he knew they had more battles ahead, but they would not face them alone. The stars came out one by one, and the fire burned low, and the wind sang through the cracks in the wood. And the night no longer felt empty, and Ziri whispered a song in her language, a sound that wrapped around Jocks like a blanket and pulled him into sleep. And the forest listened, and the earth held still, and for a little while everything was quiet again. The next morning came with a sky full of silver clouds and a wind that carried the smell of wet soil and broken leaves, and Jocks stepped outside the cabin with careful steps and eyes that moved across the tree line, searching for anything that did not belong, and the ground was soft from the rain during the night, and the traps he had set earlier had been disturbed and bent, and the wires stretched in ways that told him something had passed by during the hours they slept. But whatever it had not come close enough to break in. He walked along the edge of the forest with the rifle hanging over his back and his thoughts heavy with worry and questions, and the image of the creature disappearing into the air still burned behind his eyes, and he wondered if that was the only one or if more were hiding in the dark, waiting for the right moment to strike again. And as he returned to the cabin, he saw Ziri standing at the window, her hand pressed against the glass and her eyes distant as if looking far beyond the trees, beyond the clouds, beyond the world itself. Inside the cabin, the fire had burned low and the air held a stillness that was neither calm nor tense, but something in between, like the breath taken before a word or the pause between heartbeats. And Ziri turned as Jacques entered and held out the bracelet with a small piece of metal in her hand, and she pointed to a spot on the bracelet and then to the tools on the table, and Jacques took them without question and sat beside her and began working with quiet hands and focused eyes. They said nothing as the minutes passed, but their silence was filled with understanding and shared purpose, and the bracelet slowly began to take shape again, and its lights blinked with soft rhythm like the gentle ticking of a clock not yet complete, but not broken either. And when it was finished, Ziri looked at Jacques and placed the bracelet around her wrist and held her other hand over it and closed her eyes, and for a long moment nothing happened, and the cabin was still as stone. Then a low hum filled the air, and a soft glow rose from the bracelet, and a projection appeared between them, showing a star map filled with dots and symbols and lines that moved like rivers. And Ziri pointed to one glowing dot and looked at Jacques with tears in her eyes, and her lips formed a word that sounded like home, and the dot pulsed with light, and the bracelet beeped twice, and the map folded into itself and vanished. Ziri sat back against the wall, her eyes closed, her hands folded over her chest, and Jacques watched her, breathing slow and steady, and he knew that the signal had been sent, and that someone or something had received it, and the waiting had begun, and time was no longer their own, and every second from now would bring them closer to something new, something unknown, and possibly dangerous. The hours passed, and the sun moved across the sky, and Jacques prepared the cabin as best he could, reinforcing the windows, checking the traps, sharpening old tools, and cleaning the rifle, while Ziri rested, and sometimes soft tunes in her strange language, and the music was unlike anything Jacques had ever heard, both sad and beautiful, full of longing and strength, and it made his chest tighten in ways he could not explain. That night, as the stars returned to the sky and the fire warmed the wooden floor, Ziri stood at the door and looked out at the sky and raised her arm, and the bracelet glowed again, brighter than before, and a beam of light shot upward into the night sky like a thread, connecting Earth to the stars. And for a moment everything held still, even the wind, even the fire, even Jacques, who stood beside her with his breath caught in his chest. Then the ground shook slightly, and a strange sound filled the air like the roar of a distant engine mixed with the cry of a whale, and lights appeared far above the clouds, not blinking, not flashing, but steady and white and moving in slow, graceful motion. And Ziri placed her hand on Jacques' arm and whispered a word filled with joy and pain, and he looked at her and saw tears in her eyes again, but this time they were not from fear. A shape descended from the sky, large and glowing with soft gold and blue colors, and it hovered above the trees without touching them, and a hatch opened on its side, and a ramp extended to the ground, and figures stepped out, tall and slender, with skin like silver and eyes that glowed with warmth and knowledge. And they carried no weapons, only light in their palms and calm in their steps. Ziri stepped forward, but turned to look at Jacques one last time, and walked to him and placed both her hands on his chest and leaned her forehead against his, and her breath touched his skin, and he closed his eyes and held her close. And in that moment time stopped, and the world grew quiet again. And when he opened his eyes, she was walking toward the ship, and the figures opened their arms and welcomed her with smiles that reached their eyes. Jacques watched as she stepped into the light, and the ramp closed, and the ship rose slowly without sound and vanished into the stars, like a dream fading at dawn. And the forest remained still, and the wind moved gently through the trees, and Jacques stood alone in front of the cabin with a sky full of stars above him, and something new inside his heart. The forest stood in silence, and the wind moved like a soft breath through the leaves, and the stars above blinked with quiet rhythm as Jacques sat on the porch of his cabin with the empty chair beside him. and the cold cup of tea in his hands, and the fire inside burned low, and the night was deep but not heavy, and in his chest was a space where her voice had once echoed and her light had once warmed, and every time he closed his eyes he could still feel her hand in his, and her forehead pressed against his cheek like a goodbye that had not really ended. Days had passed since the ship rose into the sky and vanished among the stars, and Jacques had returned to his routine, slowly, carefully holding on to the moments they had shared, and the lessons she had taught without words, and the laughter that came without reason, and the silence that spoke more than any sentence could. And he kept her drawings in a small box by the bed, and her broken bracelet on the table where the morning sun touched it. First, before anything else, he walked through the forest each morning, following the paths they had walked together, and each time he passed the spot where he had first seen her in that glowing trap, he stopped and knelt and placed a hand on the earth, and remembered how small she looked, and how her eyes had begged for something more than rescue, something like hope or trust, or maybe just a second chance. And every time he left that spot, he felt a little lighter and a little stronger, and the trees no longer felt as dark as before. One evening, while watching the sky, he noticed something strange. A small flash in the same part of the stars where her ship had vanished, and it blinked. Once, then, twice, then, 3 times, and he stood and walked to the edge of the porch with his eyes fixed on the sky and his breath held tight in his chest, and the flash returned. Again, slower now, but steady, like a message written in light, and he felt something rise in his heart, something warm and familiar, and knew that night he dreamed of her standing beneath a different sky, with moons above her and rivers that glowed like fire and people that looked like her standing with open arms, and she was laughing with a sound like wind through leaves, and she held a small stone in her hand that pulsed with the same blue light as the bracelet, and she whispered his name, and he reached for her. But the dream faded, and the morning came with golden light across his face. Weeks passed, and the world around him changed slowly as spring touched the forest, and flowers returned and birds sang louder than before, and the cabin no longer felt like a place of hiding, but like a place of peace. And Jacques rebuilt the garden behind the house and planted new seeds and watched them grow, and sometimes he would speak to the trees as if they listened, and sometimes he would pause and smile for no reason, and sometimes he would hum the tunes she used to sing when the fire crackled low and the night was calm. Then one morning, as he stepped outside, he saw something at the edge of the porch. A small silver box no larger than his palm, with symbols etched into the surface and a light blinking gently at the center, and he picked it up with careful hands and felt the warmth of it spread through his fingers, and he pressed the center, and it opened with a soft chime, and inside was a folded cloth and a stone like the one from his dream, and a message written in perfect letters. Thank you for saving me. Thank you for believing in me. Thank you for giving me a place to sleep when the stars turned cold. Thank you for teaching me what kindness means. Thank you for being the reason I smile when I look at Earth from far away. Thank you for everything you are and everything you gave without asking anything back. I am safe now and I am home, but a part of my heart will always stay with you. Always. Jacques held the stone against his chest and closed his eyes and let the message settle into his soul, and he sat on the porch and looked at the trees and the sky, and he whispered her name and smiled, and the wind answered like a friend, and the birds flew higher, and the sun rose stronger, and the world kept turning with quiet grace. That night he placed the stone beside the bracelet on the table and lit a candle, and sat in silence with his thoughts and dreams and memories, and he felt her near, not like a shadow or an echo, but like something real, something close, something that never truly left. And in that silence he felt whole, and from far above, beyond the clouds, beyond the stars, beyond the dark space between worlds, a ship moved slowly past a blue planet, and inside a girl with glowing eyes and silver hair pressed her hand against the glass and smiled, and the stars blinked in reply, and the journey continued, not as an end, but as a beginning, not of fear, not of war, not of sorrow, but of something better, something brighter, something made from the bond between two souls from different worlds who shared a story that would live forever in the space between stars.